Empaths don't leave like other people do. There's no slammed door, no shaking voice, no emotional trial where evidence is presented and blame is assigned. Their exit is quieter, colder, almost invisible until the air shifts and you realize someone essential is suddenly gone. Most people think disappearances are impulsive. With empaths, the impulse happened years earlier. The leaving is just the moment the internal math finally resolves. They don't run when it hurts. They run when the pain stops being episodic and becomes architectural, built into the structure of every interaction, every silence, every unspoken expectation. Picture it. A person who walks into every conversation already sensing the emotional temperature. Not because they want to, but because they can't not. A person who never needed words to understand you, but always needed words to be understood. Someone who spent their life handing out emotional CPR in rooms where no one checked whether they themselves were still breathing. And one day, without theatrics, they stop, not because they hardened, but because they finally felt the full weight of their own softness. The world didn't break them in one dramatic moment. It drained them slowly, the way frost works on stone. Invisible damage, quiet cracking. No witnesses. Jung saw this kind of departure clearly. The moment a person chooses themselves not out of rebellion, but realization. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Carl Jung. For empaths, leaving without warning isn't a statement. It's a verdict whispered only to themselves, long before anyone else hears the silence that follows. They don't owe an explanation at the end, because they were the explanation from the beginning. And when they go, they don't return. Not out of spite, but because the part of them that once stayed for everyone else has finally, mercifully, run out. They leave without sound, but the pressure before the silence is deafening. Not loud, just relentless. The kind of pressure that never spikes enough to be noticed, never breaks enough to be acknowledged. The kind that simply accumulates, layer after invisible layer, until departure becomes the only honest movement left. Because before empaths learn how to leave others, they first learn how to endure them. The mistake people make is assuming empaths choose to absorb. They don't. They resonate. Like a tuning fork struck once and never allowed to stop vibrating. Every conversation, every unspoken shift in someone's tone, every emotional undercurrent rippling beneath a neutral sentence, they feel it all, not as events, but as echoes inside their nervous system. Most people walk into a room and read the faces. Empaths walk into a room and read the atmosphere between the faces. The friction, the emotional electricity, the things no one is admitting, but everyone is leaking. They don't need to be addressed directly to feel the emotional debris. They just need to be present to register it. That's the burden. Not participation. Awareness. And awareness is a hungry, draining occupation. Imagine being the person who always senses when something is off, even when everyone insists it isn't. You sit across from someone who says they're fine, but their pauses tell a different story. You listen not to respond, but to translate what the other person can't articulate. You spend the conversation handing them emotional clarity, pulling words out of their fog, organizing their internal chaos into sentences they can digest. Then you walk away, realizing the entire exchange was a one-way act of psychic labor. No one asked how your inner world was structured. No one noticed you were doing the structuring. Jung warned about patterns like this long before they were labeled. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Empaths don't leave because they stop caring. They leave because they finally recognize the transaction they never agreed to, the emotional economy where they are always the translator, the stabilizer, the container for feelings too heavy, too tangled, or too inconvenient for others to carry themselves. The cost isn't sympathy. It's saturation. Over years, it begins to feel like emotional homelessness, like living in everyone's inner world except your own. Constantly calibrating, emotionally bracing, softening edges that weren't yours to soften, anticipating needs that were never reciprocated, soothing moods that were never acknowledged as real. The exhaustion isn't dramatic enough for anyone to name it abuse. But it's chronic enough for the empath to realize it's erasing them anyway. The leaving happens when they finally feel the cognitive dissonance snap shut. Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling. Carl Jung. Empaths leave when the conflict becomes permanent residency, when resonance stops being a gift and becomes a sentence, when emotional attunement turns into unpaid servitude, when they realize the world never wanted their truth, only their ability to hold other people's truths without trembling. So they do the only thing left that belongs fully to them. They stop vibrating for everyone else. Not loudly, not angrily, just finally. And that stillness is the first breath they've taken in years. If resonance was the weight, this is the thinning. Because the empath doesn't just carry too much, they slowly trade pieces of themselves to make room for what they carry. Not a conscious sacrifice, never ceremonial. More like incremental amputation by accommodation. By the time they leave, there is less of a self-departing than people assume ever existed. Empaths aren't shaped by self-expression. They're shaped by self-editing. They learn early that having sharp edges in a world full of emotional volatility is dangerous, so they sand themselves down, slowly, quietly, reflexively. Not to be better, to be less disruptive, less demanding, less noticeable, less like someone who might require something in return. The erosion doesn't happen in breakdowns, it happens in adjustments. They adjust volume before speaking, so no one hears neediness in their voice. They adjust emotional reaction before reacting, so no one sees disappointment register on their face. They adjust honesty before being honest, so truth never lands like an accusation. They adjust presence before being present, so they occupy less space than their sensitivity actually requires. After years, they become fluent in self-translation, converting their own emotions into versions others can tolerate. A grief becomes tired. A wound becomes miscommunication. A longing becomes it's fine. A boundary becomes a suggestion delivered so gently it dissolves before it can defend them. And one day they realize something chilling. They haven't been relating to people. They've been diluting themselves for people. Jung described the psychological danger of this more precisely than most ever could. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung. For the empath, that privilege keeps getting postponed. Not stolen in one dramatic robbery, but chipped away like paint left too long in the rain. No moment dramatic enough to mourn. Just a slow vanishing of color. Consider the moment they notice it, not as sadness, but estrangement. You're mid-conversation, listening deeply, responding carefully, regulating emotional undertones, absorbing tension without naming it, offering patience before impatience is even earned. And suddenly it hits you that you are performing a version of yourself engineered entirely for emotional convenience. You wonder when you last spoke without softening first. You wonder when you last felt something without disguising it as something smaller. You wonder when you last took up space without apologizing through tone. You wonder if you ever existed outside of emotional service. That is erosion, not loss of identity, loss of permission to have one. Jung again puts a lantern to the psychological wound. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Carl Jung. Empaths terrify themselves last. Everyone else gets the softened draft. They get the redacted edition. They get the emotionally optimized interface. What no one sees is that every act of understanding others has been quietly subtracting from the empath's capacity to understand themselves without distortion. Erosion eventually reaches a tipping point where adaptation feels indistinguishable from self-betrayal. They catch themselves censoring instinctively, even in silence, even alone. And that is the most frightening stage of all, when the empath begins to perform emotional moderation, even when there is no audience left to demand it. So they leave, not because they suddenly found strength, but because they suddenly found the absence of themselves unbearable. They don't return because the person who once stayed was not a self, but a function, a system of emotional responsiveness built to keep others comfortable. When they walk away, it's not from people, it's from the role that was slowly consuming the human inside it. And the tragedy is this: no one sees the erosion while it happens. They only notice the absence when the empath finally stops disappearing inside the room, and instead disappears from it entirely. And erosion, unlike rupture, has no dramatic sound. It just weakens the structure silently until something trivial delivers the final blow. Not the worst blow, just the last one the system can register without crumbling. When the empath finally breaks, it isn't visible chaos. It's the sudden withdrawal of reflection. The mirror doesn't crack outward. It fractures in relevance. Empaths don't see themselves as mirrors at first. They think they're simply attentive, intuitive, responsible, useful. They believe emotional attunement is a form of relational generosity, not realizing they have slowly been trained into becoming a psychological surface others lean into, to see themselves more clearly, never the empath standing behind the glass. Mirrors don't ask for recognition. They just return what stands before them. But the empath's mirror isn't made of silver and glass. It's made of pattern recognition, emotional reflex, micro-adjustments in tone, posture, patience, and perception. It reflects reassurance before panic forms, neutrality before conflict escalates, understanding before confusion hardens, and emotional translation before someone even knows they needed it. The fracture begins when the empath realizes this truth. A mirror is not a relationship. It's an emotional utility. The shattering moment is never one betrayal. It's the instant they notice the reflection no longer resembles a mutual exchange, but a psychological dependency loop they've been fueling alone. Here's what that moment feels like in lived motion. You raise a concern, delivered softly, diplomatically, filtered for emotional tolerance, and the other person reacts not with curiosity, but defensiveness, not accountability, but interpretation of threat. They accuse your feelings of distortion, your perception of exaggeration, your exhaustion of unfairness. They say something like, "You're too sensitive," or you're reading into it, or it wasn't that deep, or the most efficient dismissal of all. I didn't mean it like that. And suddenly, the empath feels it, not as pain, but clarity, not a crack, a recognition. Jung's voice fits here like a gavel striking bone. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Carl Jung. Empaths are irritated last. Before irritation, there is internalization. Before internalization, there is justification. Before justification, there is adaptation. They metabolize every emotional disruption internally, trying to understand the other person's unconscious motivations more than their conscious behavior. They carry the emotional consequence themselves, so others never have to feel confronted by their own impact. But in the mirror-shatter moment, irritation finally surfaces. And instead of leading to mutual understanding, it leads to invalidation. That's the fracture. Jung again offers the psychological blueprint of the break. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. Carl Jung. Empaths don't leave because the shoe pinched. They leave because someone insisted it didn't pinch at all. The mirror shatters when the empath realizes their perception is only valued when it comforts, never when it reveals. Their emotional labor is welcome, but their emotional limits are inconvenient. Their sensitivity is praised as intuition, but condemned as fragility. Their understanding is consumed, but their boundaries are negotiable. Their presence is relied upon, but their interiority is never explored. And in that instant, something inside them stops cooperating. Not rage, not grief, a system shut down. They don't scream. They stop reflecting. Because once the empath sees the mirror as a mechanism, not a connection, the illusion of participation dies. The fracture isn't emotional. It's existential. The world doesn't distort. It resolves. They see themselves not as someone loved for their depth, but as someone accessed for their permeability. So the mirror breaks not from impact, but from misuse. And the empath does the one thing mirrors cannot do. They walk away from the surface entirely. No announcement, no negotiation, just departure. Because the mirror didn't break when it was cracked. It broke when it was finally seen. The mirror shatters, and suddenly people expect noise. But the empath doesn't fracture into chaos. They dissolve into silence. Because once the illusion breaks, there is nothing left to defend, argue, or explain. Departure becomes less like a decision and more like the final stage of an emotional evolution no one else realized was unfolding. When empaths leave without warning, people misread the moment. They think it was abrupt, cold, emotional, reactionary. But the empath's vanishing is none of those things. It's diagnostic. The quiet conclusion of a long psychological observation where the subject of study was never others. It was the empath inside the system of others. Their exit feels sudden to the outside world, because the entire unraveling happened internally, long before movement followed. The empath disappears when they finally see the emotional ecosystem they were living in, one where their sensitivity acted like an open infrastructure everyone used, but no one mapped. Vanishing isn't impulsive, it's post-recognition. Here's the core misunderstanding. People think empaths leave because they were hurt. Empaths leave because they were finally lucid. They realize they were never interacting as a self, but functioning as an emotional interface, absorbing instability, predicting emotional weather, buffering tension, and translating the unsaid into something socially digestible. They weren't leaving conversations drained, they were leaving them uninhabited. Jung described this moment of internal severance better than anyone anticipated. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. Carl Jung. The empath carries a parallel burden, the unlived emotional accountability of others. The feelings people refuse to trace back to themselves. The psychological blind spots others outsource to the empath's nervous system. The subtext no one takes ownership of, but expects the empath to metabolize silently. And once they see it, they cannot unsee it. Their silence afterward isn't empty. It's full of inventory. They don't block people, because blocking would imply conflict. They don't explain, because explanations were never part of the contract. They don't return, because return would mean resuming a role, not reclaiming a self. Think of situations like this. You spend years making emotional discomfort easier for others to sit with, only to realize no one has ever made your discomfort easier for you. You tell someone the truth once, measured, softened, edited for emotional tolerance, and they respond like honesty itself was the crime. You feel the imbalance not as resentment, but structure. You realize empathy had slowly turned into environmental contamination control, and you were the filter everyone assumed regenerated automatically. Jung again provides the psychological lantern for the moment after disappearance. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung. The empath's darkness wasn't malice. It was depletion without witness. They vanish when they finally make conscious what others never wanted to examine. That being understood by an empath is effortless, but understanding an empath requires effort no one ever planned to give. So they leave, not to teach a lesson, not to provoke regret, not to be chased. They leave because the emotional world they were living in was never reciprocal enough to return to, and silence was the only remaining language that still belonged entirely to them. Their vanishing reveals the truth of the entire connection. They were not holding a relationship. They were holding the pressure of being the one who holds everything. And once that is revealed, once the system is seen in full light, there is no going back to being the mirror, the translator, the emotional shock absorber. So they don't return. Because what shattered was never the relationship. It was the empath's belief that they were participating in one at all. And after the silence settles, the question always forms too late. Why didn't they say anything? But empaths don't leave at the moment of explanation. They leave at the moment explanation becomes impossible. Because the departure wasn't an argument. It was a psychological horizon closing behind them. Empaths reach a stage where leaving is no longer emotional. It's definitive self-preservation. They don't cross a line outward, they cross one inward. The moment they realize returning would mean abandoning themselves again. Jung captured the psychology of that final threshold with surgical precision. What you resist persists. Carl Jung. Empaths stop resisting, and that's why nothing persists enough to return to. They don't go back because the connection was never the anchor. They were. When they leave, they finally withdraw from the cycle of compensating for emotional blind spots that were never theirs to fix. No hatred, no plea. Just a sealed chapter. They don't return because the world they left behind required their disappearance to function, and the world they stepped into afterward was finally their own. If you've ever felt like you give too much of yourself, like the world takes without noticing, pause for a second. Protect your energy. Set your boundaries. And remember, leaving isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only way to reclaim who you truly are. If this video resonated with you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because there's more insight coming on how to survive a world that doesn't always see you. Thanks for watching and being here.